Mini episode 709 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by The Unheard Scene, your home for great music interviews of all stripes. Follow them on the web at unheardscene.com.
The FDH Lounge. You want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Welcome, everyone, to FDH Lounge, mini episode number 709. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris, and here today on the show where nothing is off topic, we have a very fascinating topic, I would say. We're going to be speaking with the author of the book, HALEN Rising, How a Southern California Backyard Party Band Saved Heavy Metal. That, of course, is author and PhD historian Greg Renoff. Glad to bring him on the show and get into this discussion. Greg, welcome to the FDH Lounge today, sir. Thank you so much for sending out this excellent book for us to go through and prepare, and it's a wonderful read, I think.
Hey, gentlemen, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you. I have to say, my first question that I have, and this is one that it wouldn't surprise me if you'd gotten this in some other interviews. It would actually surprise me if you hadn't, because I would just say, in terms of talking about this book internally with some of our fellow FDH Lounge contributors, one of the first thoughts that kept coming up was Van Halen is a band you absolutely think of when you hear the phrase hard rock / heavy metal. There are not a lot of people that I've heard, or that a lot of us internally have heard of, that just associate them with heavy metal per se.
Yeah.
So in terms of the premise of the book, where were you coming from on that as far as them being the band that paved the way for the big metal renaissance in the 80s?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to think about, and I would put it into this context, is that what we consider, bands in here in the 21st century consider heavy metal is not what heavy metal would have been considered in the late 70s. And so, I was thinking about when I wrote the book and how to kind of explain this to people is that, in the 70s, sure, we would still look at Black Sabbath as heavy metal today, but bands like Mountain, Grand Funk, even Queen, Kiss, Ted Nugent, all of these groups were called heavy metal. If you open up the Cream magazine from 1978, they're going to call these groups heavy metal. And in fact, looking at the same magazines from the same era to kind of capture what people were saying, or the journalists were saying to describe the band, they were calling Van Halen a heavy metal band. And so, I think the thing is, when I tried to work out the way to take that forward in the book, one of the things I was interested too, and kind of trying to make clear at the end of the book, is that I'm not making the case that Van Halen, gave us Metallica. What I was more saying is that Van Halen sort of kept the metal flag afloat in the late 70s by making over-the-top guitar solos, those screams, the heavy riffs we all love, kind of more palatable. They got into the top 40. Van Halen was super successful, and their first album sold 2 million copies at a time when disco and soft rock were way, way more popular than anything as heavy as Van Halen. And then going to the 80s, of course, what I think Van Halen gave us is pop metal. There were a lot of different places people drew on that. I mean, you can look at a band like Poison. Obviously, they were influenced by a band like Kiss, and other bands as well. But certainly, I think Van Halen kind of set down that template for a lot of those bands that became popular in the 80s. Well, I was like, the hair metal or glam metal bands, that was the Van Halen template.
Gotcha. So for anybody who looks at it and feels that it's a little bit jarring as far as thinking about the context of it, and they say heavy metal, is it as simple in a large concept as looking at it through the eyes of the time as opposed to looking back on it now, or perhaps it might seem a little more jarring?
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like you're saying if you look at it from the eyes of the time, it kind of fit in with the way the landscape was.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I love to send people a copy of Cream magazine from 1978, and they talk about it's heavy metal going down the drain or something like that, and it's like, it's Kiss, it's Queen, it's Led Zeppelin. Again, we would not call those bands, quote-unquote, heavy metal today, but at the time, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that 1978 moment where, look, Foreigner was super popular, Boston was popular. That was sort of considered to be sort of the future of harder rock. And Van Halen was, much, in my estimation, much heavier, much more aggressive than those bands. Where Van Halen, look, even out of Warner Brothers, when I did interviews for the book, I was told, even by Ted Templeman, that people came up to Templeman and were kind of like, yeah, you're the hit producer here, you're vice president of the label, but we don't have enormous confidence that this band's going to break through, because it just wasn't seen to be something that was going to be the wave of the future. I mean, punk that's really what people saw as the future. It was like, look at the Sex Pistols and, and the Ramones. Even though those bands didn't end up selling a lot down the road, in 1977, 1978, they were considered to be the next bands that were going to pack stadiums. That never happened. I mean, we know that never happened for punk rock.
That's a very good point, and I would say we've had Lou Gramm on the show, but I think he would hardly take umbrage if we were to say that Foreigner wasn't very metal. So, yeah, I mean, if anybody was suggesting that at the time, it probably didn't look right at the time, nor certainly as time went along. But, yeah, Van Halen is certainly much closer than that.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, too, that's the other point I was trying to make in the book, is that on paper, and when you listen to the first Van Halen record, it didn't sound like Foreigner. It didn't sound like Boston. Sure. It didn't sound like that sort of like a more radio-friendly, smoother. I mean, Van Halen had a lot more rough edges to it. Eddie's guitar playing, raw screams. I love Foreigner. I love Boston. But my point is that if you were looking for a future for a heavier, more aggressive music, people didn't really see it coming out of the tradition that Van Halen came out of, which is, the influence being Grand Funk, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin. I mean, those were kind of what Van Halen drew from in terms of their influences. And taking that forward, a lot of by the late 70s, the take was that, Zeppelin's over, Black Sabbath is dying, Kiss is washed up, and so there was kind of sense that this is over. We're going to a different stage or a different phase in music history, and so, yeah, for me, that Van Halen to wave that flag and keep that metal, that hard, whatever you want to call it, hard rock, alive, to me was super important.
Well, you've somewhat anticipated already. I had two follow-up questions I wanted to ask off of that, and one of those, you started to go there a little bit, and this is where I found in your writing also the whole notion that, again, David Lee Roth being the guy who, and this would be kind of unsurprising when you look at the showmanship, that he's the one that kind of moved him more in the direction away from the purer metal that maybe Eddie Van Halen was doing at the time. Is this one of these situations where you could say, but for David Lee Roth, they might look indisputably metal even today?
I think, so people have asked me that question. I really think that Eddie and Alex and Michael Anthony, they were musicians who were good enough that they would have been successful musicians no matter who they had singing for them, whatever combination. But I could certainly have seen, without a Roth, those guys ending up being like a Jeff Beck-style fusion trio or something like that. That I could see someone coming along and saying, we want to sign your band, but we want to make Eddie the star. And that probably could have worked in some ways. I mean, you can imagine that type of guitar playing that Eddie had, he could have fit well with those types of guitar hero mold and maybe do something like Jeff Beck did where it's more instrumental music. For Roth, I think the estimation of Roth for a lot of people was that he was just sort of a guy who kind of got lucky. Like he stumbled into this band. You have Eddie Van Halen writes all these songs. But I started to do this research and I interviewed dozens and dozens of people in Pasadena and people who were deeply involved with the band when they broke through. Their manager, Marshall Burrell at the time, Ed Templeman, Don Landy, their engineer. You find out how important Roth was to sort of shaping their sound, and especially Roth being a guy who wanted early on, as you point out, to tell the guys, look, we're not going to get anywhere playing Black Sabbath covers. We have to play more commercial music if we're ever going to be able to make it. Roth kind of understood that, that's not a road that's going to go anywhere, that at some point, being able to play 25-minute jams, that's going to kind of play itself out. And Roth, I think, understood that the pop music format, the 3-minute song, that's really what is much more marketable. And he was right. I mean, he was the guy who pushed those guys to do that stuff. And so when I talked to Mark Stone, who was Van Halen's first bass player before Michael Anthony, he talked about how they would play the whole first side of a Who record or something. That was sort of what Van Halen made their bones on, being able to play these long before Roth. But Roth kind of comes in the picture and goes, let's just play My Generation. Let's just play these pop songs rather than trying to be these heavy metal acrobats in how we play. And I think that's where Roth really deserves a lot of credit for understanding that pop music could be melded to this heavier sound in a way that could be something fresh and new. And Roth, it took a long time for those guys to get there, to get to that real sound, the Van Halen sound, to really get it nailed down like they did in 1978. But Roth deserves an enormous amount of credit. I have tremendous respect for the guy.
Absolutely, and as I said, I think that would surprise nobody to learn that he was the biggest influence in that direction because of the showmanship. that he brings. This is a very interesting thing for me just because, again, if I'm to narrow it down to one decade, it might be the 70s. That's my favorite because of the eclecticism of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And the changing sounds throughout the decade. So my second follow-up question, when we're talking about genres of music, and this is where, again, branding people in the 70s, branding acts, really a lot of times, as you said, in particular, we may look back on it and say that it may not seem to apply as much in retrospect as it did at the time. I have to think we're talking about that all the much more so. I came across some other writing that you put out there in terms of Eddie Van Halen objecting to the first album cover, that he thought that the record label wanted him to look a little bit too much like The Clash. So, again, I don't think that anybody ever, under any circumstances, would envision Van Halen as embodying punk rock. So in terms of how a record label executive might look at them in 1978, it was in the middle of the punk rock moment. But, boy, that would seem to be the ultimate kind of round peg, square hole kind of a deal if you try and push them that way.
It's interesting, you bring that up because that was, I think, the best evidence that I could bring to the table to kind of show that people at Warner Brothers, at least the art department, didn't see these guys any more than, like you're saying, they're like, we're just going to try to market these guys as a new hot rock band, and we're going to kind of quasi make them into a punk band. And they weren't looking for David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen to come out with clothes with safety pins on and all that stuff. But that was sort of, again, if you're thinking about the Clash, it's like you're pointing out the Sex Pistols, the Ramones. That was seen to be the wave of the future. And so when you have this young rockin' band out of L.A., where there are actually quite a few punk bands that start out, none of them get to be super successful. But the Sunset Strip had really gone punk in 1977, right before Van Halen breaks big nationally in 78. Yeah, that was the thing. It's like, let's make these guys we'll market them that way. And Eddie and the rest of those guys were outraged by that because, they thought those other bands were a joke, to be honest. I think Eddie said that himself. They just didn't, they just thought there were people who just basically learned how to play guitar like a year ago, whereas, someone like Eddie who prided himself on being a virtuoso, it was just seen those bands were not at all what Van Halen considered their peers.
Oh, absolutely. And again, they were very much authentic. That was a big part of their brand anyways. And, to try to force them into being pushed as something that they're not would go against any chance for success in the first place. In terms of everything that you've got in the book there, I want to build to the Texas Music Festival later on because I feel like that's sort of almost a good part of the climax of the book. But as far as everything kind of building up to that, this book, one of the things that I thought was really excellent was on your website, VanHalenRising.com, a lot of the sort of rhetorical questions that you're putting out there kind of led you into this. I'd just like you to take it any direction you want to as far as the backstory here, things that you started kind of delving into at the beginning of your thought process, things you were finding, but just to kind of take us through this general journey of what it was like to put together this untold backstory of Van Halen.
Yeah, let's talk about the Texas Music Festival because I think that's a great illustration of what I was trying to get at the book. I grew up a big Van Halen fan. I ended up going to grad school, becoming a historian, all that good stuff. But one thing that really started to stick with me is that I knew a lot about Van Halen starting in 1978 if I was someone who read magazines and read some books on Van Halen, but I didn't really feel like any of those books or magazine articles had done a particularly good job of capturing what Van Halen was before they were famous. And so July 1978, Van Halen comes into Dallas, Texas for the Texas World Music Festival. Texas Jam, sorry about that. Texas Jam. 100,000 people are going to be there. It ends up being a day that's over 100 degrees, and Van Halen is going to play at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Before Van Halen gets to Texas, their equipment is lost. They're coming back from Japan, and so Eddie loses some of his guitars, the drum riser, Alice's drum kit. Most of their gear was lost. So they have to rent gear the day before the show. You can imagine they're playing for the biggest crowd they've ever played before. They're going to be opening for this festival. It's going to have bands like Heart, Head East, a lot of the big bands at the time. These guys are obviously going to be, facing some adversity there with the heat as well. And they came out and absolutely sold the show. Ask anyone who was there. They said Van Halen was just a force of nature. And for me, that type of thing was a good starting point to going, how do these guys get that good? Because you don't get that good, forming your band in January 1978 or November 1977. And then you go back and I work my way through the history of the band. Roth joins in 73, and these guys played everywhere from every dive bar in Los Angeles, wet T-shirt contests, backyard parties. They played for van clubs. They played for biker clubs. They did everything that you can think of to just hone their chops. Now, they weren't doing that thinking we have to get better, we're going to play more. But when you play for years and years and years in front of every sort of crowd possible, and they were also playing, by the way, in front of 3,000 people in their own hometown of Pasadena, these concerts in 1977, so they had played in front of some large crowds before they had a record deal. But that's how Van Halen got that good. And for me, with those questions I have on my website, I want to know, how did Van Halen get that good enough that you go out to the Texas Jam and you steal the show, or you can go out and play with Black Sabbath, and it's pretty clear that Van Halen was getting the best of Black Sabbath night after night after night. And, you know, this is not something that's supposed to happen. You're not supposed to have basically a bar band from Los Angeles come out and be able to walk off the stage to screaming crowds every single night like they did, but they did it.
Absolutely. One of the things, too, that kind of makes it interesting to tie back to what we said about the Clash before is when you look at the punk genre, that is the one that I think of the most as far as the whole DIY ethos. But when you look at what Van Halen did, they may not be playing punk rock music, but they really kind of embodied that maybe even better than a lot of the punk bands of the time, because the picture you paint in there of the sweat and the hustle and going all around SoCal and from their anchor base in Pasadena, everything that they accomplished in the years leading up to this, they seem to embody that better than a lot of the punk bands we associate with that, I would think.
Oh, great point. I think the thing really interesting is that you're nailing it. These guys, you know, Roth ends up being born, eventually living in fairly, he lives in this mansion in Pasadena. It's kind of strange because his father sort of becomes more and more successful as a doctor while Roth is in Van Halen. But the Van Halens themselves, when they're living, if people are in Southern California, go over to Los Lunas in Pasadena and do a drive-by the house. I mean, it is a small house. Those guys, came from very, very blue-collar, humble beginnings, driving the crappiest cars around Southern California, like you said, loading up the drum riser, loading up the amps in these vans, driving around, and they worked their asses off. And they didn't have a manager until 1977. I mean, they had people who, may have helped them promote shows and stuff, but they didn't have a quote-unquote manager until 1977. And so they don't get signed until the same time. So you're exactly right. So 73, 74, 75, 76, these guys are out doing it on their own. There's nobody directing them or telling them what to do. It's Roth and the other guys just started, kind of making their own way and being resilient too. That's, to me, one of the most inspirational parts of the Van Halen story is that when you read the book, I hope people dig into it. To me, even if you're not a rock fan, you can draw inspiration from the refusal to quit. When you look at the odds of getting signed and how really everyone was telling people would tell Van Halen, the guitar player is great, but, the singer isn't that good. And, heavy metal's not really marketable anymore. And what all these things, let's face it, the fact that Gene Simmons couldn't get them a record deal. That's the thing. Can you imagine living with that the night after? Like, Gene Simmons takes you to New York and presents you on a silver platter to his manager, Bill Aucoin, and Bill Aucoin goes, you guys aren't good enough. I don't want you guys. I want Billy Squier and Piper. Those guys refuse to quit. And to me, that's an incredible inspiration to just saying, hey, you know what? If you believe in your art and you believe in what you're doing, just stay with it long enough and good things can happen.
That's amazing. And I have to say, too, and I don't know if this is one of these takes looking back at the decade or whether this should have been more apparent at the time, but when I go back to what I said before about the eclecticism of the 70s and all the different things that were happening, the transition over a period of time, part of it, it seems to me that it's remarkable that anybody could be so sure that these guys weren't going to make it. And it seems like people were making very ironclad pronouncements at a time when everything was in flux. I mean, who saw punk coming? Who saw disco coming, really? So it seems kind of weird to think that people were making ironclad statements at a point in time when it seemed like everything was kind of written in jello.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that you pick up as you learn a little bit about the music industry in the 70s is that there were a lot of these, talent scouts, these A&R guys who'd be with record companies, and some of them were better than others. I mean, Templeman, for example, was a guy who was an A&R guy who got the Doobie Brothers and Van Halen. So, his track record, if you look back on it, pretty good. Montrose, right? That's pretty good. But there are a lot of other guys who, and women who weren't as good. And so, part of what that means was like scouting bands and making pronouncements. And you had, some people had better luck at others in picking this out. But, I think the thing too about the trends there, because punk got so huge in the UK UK in '76, I think the assumption was it was going to take the same way in the United States, and it was just going to burn over the country like wildfire. And it didn't happen. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why that didn't end up happening. The punk really was much more of an urban music, and really didn't really connect with people like if you're living in a farm town in Fargo. You're not going to connect with punk rock, and so it didn't have that sort of more universal appeal to the American market. But you're right. I mean, there was just sort of this, with all these different directions, there was sort of this like, this is dead, this isn't going to work. But even look at disco. I mean, disco seemed like the endless gold mine, and eventually the gold stopped being found, and it just blew up on itself.
You are absolutely right about that, by the way, as far as the whole urban and rural dichotomy with punk. I remember reading about, I think it was the Sex Pistols, about some of the shows that they were doing down south and having to put up chicken wire to keep people from throwing stuff at them. So, yeah, that is, for anybody that thought that was going to take in the redneck areas.
No, I live in Tulsa, and so they played right here at King's Ballroom. Van Halen ended up playing here, by the way, just about a year after the Clash, the Sex Pistols came through. And you're right. I mean, it was not. I don't think it was a particularly successful tour of Texas and Arizona, these places. It just, yeah, and that was it. And that killed the Sex Pistols. They break up when they get to San Francisco. It took one bus ride across the U.S. to kill those guys.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. That shows you the staying power of that medium as far as the ability to take it all over the country. But you mentioned about with Van Halen specifically embodying a blue-collar ethos as far as how they built themselves. And if you're looking at the elements of the band, and I know you've written about this as well, the one that you associate probably the most with that would be Michael Anthony, who, of course, is no longer part of things these days. Really seems to have that severe heat with the band. So is it everything? Is it as simplified as essentially, the boss wanted the spot for his son, and it came down to that? Or are there other issues there? Because the more famous public issues, of course, have always been between Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth, and yet the bitterness in this matter here seems to be much more profound.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I talked to Michael Anthony, and I didn't bring up the recent interview for the book. And I didn't bring up the quote unquote recent stuff about the stuff that happened with Wolfie and other stuff. But he seemed completely unembittered by the whole thing. It's interesting. He had to talk about the early days, and I never got the slightest sense from him that he was looking back and anger about that stuff that happened back then. But you're right. I think the things that end up happening are probably multifaceted. One, Wolfie came to be a certain age, and Eddie wanted to play with his kid. But also what ends up happening, I think, is that Michael Anthony ends up being kind of a whipping boy inside of Van Halen. I think he was always the go-along guy, and I'm going to guess that, when you had those polls in place where it was Roth and the Van Halen brothers, or Sammy and the Van Halen brothers, Mike was sort of out of the crossfire there. But what ended up happening is that I think once you see Sammy exit the band, and Roth is not no longer in the band, I think there's this sort of, who else is left? And ends up being that Anthony ends up taking a lot of heat. And part of that stuff is just, to me, I wish Eddie Van Halen could look at it a little bit differently. You probably know, and your listeners probably know, that one of the things that ended up happening is that Michael Anthony's name was removed from the songwriting credits from 1984. Very famously, there was a four-way split done back in 1977, where after you sign a contract with Warner Brothers, or while you're signing them, you have to decide how are you going to do songwriting credits. In other words, here are the songs you guys are going to do on your album. Who wrote the song? And the band decided to say, we all wrote the songs, which meant the publishing was split four ways. Well, in later years, that became apparently a big sticking point to Eddie. And I was told by somebody who was involved with that process of basically was having conversations with the band when they were making that decision at Warner Brothers. This person worked for Warner Brothers at the time, and the person told me that the band was advised not to do that. At least some people in the band, meaning Eddie, was advised it's not in your best interest to split it four ways because down the road it's going to cause problems. But there was the sense we're all for one for all, and we're going to do that. And I thought about it for a long time, and I'm thinking to myself, why? Now, Roth, we know, wrote the melodies and the lyrics, and Eddie wrote 95% of the music. Alex doesn't write. Michael Anthony didn't write. But then I really started to think about it, that if you're Eddie Van Halen, and you've got a brother in the band, my speculation is that Eddie decided to go along with the four-way split or just to vote for a four-way split because it'd be pretty hard to justify, well, I want to give money to my brother, so he should get a cut. Dave should get a cut because he writes the lyrics. I'll get a cut, but we'll cut Mike out back then. If you know what I'm saying, right? So Alex does it right. And so the four-way split kind of became the default way to saying, okay, look, this kind of provides for everybody. And as a brother, again, I want to be clear that I've never heard a quote from Eddie saying that. I've never heard a quote from Alex saying that. Michael Anthony didn't tell me that. Nobody told me that. But kind of putting it together, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Because now what's ended up happening is that Michael Anthony's name is off of 1984. He's no longer a songwriter in 1984, which, for better or for worse, it was there for years, and they must have renegotiated a deal with him somehow or forced him to give up those publishing rights. And it's, I think all in all, it's an unfortunate thing. I think anybody who's a Van Halen fan can sort of say, hey, you know what, I'd love to play with my kid too, and I understand that Eddie wanted to play with his kid, and that's great and everything, but I think a lot of people would love to see those guys kind of tie everything up in a bow and, do it one more time the right way with the four original members, do a tour or do a song or something, to kind of make it right for the posterity.
Absolutely. And again, a lot of the issues that you've seen with a lot of other big bands over the years as far as the egos and the personalities when you start getting into the money. And again, I had alluded to it just briefly as far as Roth and Eddie Van Halen, as far as that dynamic between them there. And you do a good job in talking in the book about all the things that were happening in the early days and how they came together and the chemistry things, both pro and con. But was there always a sense that you had as you were going through this that you could see the elements of what were going to lead to some of this sort of Jagger and Richards public feuding in the years to come? Were there obvious seeds that were coming out based on when they were nobody?
Yeah, no, Ross said something in 1985. He said, right before the band split up, he said, I always had the fear that one day I'd wake up in the hotel room and everyone would be gone. That they basically dump him, fired, we're gone, And, I think Roth's position in the band was always sort of, how would I explain it? I think he was always understanding that for all of his talents as a promoter, all of his talents as a front man, that aside, Roth always understood that vocally, before he was famous, before he's David Lee Roth, before he's just Dave Roth, this guy's the singer for the band, everyone saw that Dave Roth was not the singer that Eddie Van Halen was as a guitar player. So I think that was always part of the insecurity within the band for Dave. I've said this before, but if you think about the great 70s singers, the guys he would have been compared to, the Robert Plant, the Ian Gillans, the Ozzies, even Ozzy when he would sing really well back then, the Freddie Mercurys. I mean, Roth didn't really fit in that mold of hey, Foreigner, Boston. Think of these bands with the great virtuoso singers. And so, I think Roth always was sort of this person who understood that there was this maybe this tenuous relationship with the brothers. Even then, after Bill Aucoin tells the brothers and Michael Anthony and Roth all together that the big weakness in the band is the vocals to their faces. Roth says that in his own book. But the other thing, too, is that Roth was a guy who pushed those guys to go in directions they probably weren't initially comfortable. I mean that as a compliment. So dressing up. In the book, I have photographs of those guys, Eddie and Alex, wearing flannel shirts and jeans. Roth was like, we got to dress flashier. You got to play the part. You got to be a rock star. And Roth's the guy who got those guys to move around on stage. Eddie, particularly Michael Anthony, got those guys to sort of, hey, we got to put on a show. And so, I think all of those things kind of rolling together. Despite that, I think that there was always that resentment there that Roth was stealing the show. Roth was basically, it's the brothers band, right? It's Van Halen, but Roth is claiming all of the, claiming all the fame for himself. So I think that's always part of the equation. I mean, there was always, Roth will say it, there was always tension. But let's give credit where credit is due to the brothers. Eddie and Alex recognized they needed their frontman. And the smartest decision they ever made, probably in terms of their whole career, was hiring Roth. I mean, I don't think that's debatable. That was the smartest business move they ever made, was saying, even though our local fans in Pasadena, our teenage high school fans, our friends think Roth's a weirdo and they don't like the way he sings, we need this guy because he, looks good, moves good, he brings the girls out, and he's got all of this charisma. And they were right. And they got the right guy in the band, let's face it.
They did, absolutely. I'd like to ask you if you think that accounts for the tenuous piece in later years like now. Always tenuous, but between the Van Halen brothers and David Lee Roth, have they come belatedly to that full-throated realization that, again, Eddie being the guitar god, being the hard worker who's doing all the backbone kind of stuff here, but again, they wouldn't be Van Halen, they wouldn't have been a global phenomenon without the ideas that David Lee Roth brought to the table and without the showmanship that he brought. Has that kind of dawned on everybody at this point here in their older age?
I don't know. Again, this is just my speculation, right? Again, I want to be clear. I've never interviewed Alex Van Halen, never interviewed Eddie Van Halen. They've never cooperated in any sort of book, as far as I know, that's been published. And so, this is my speculation. I still believe that when you think about it, things really haven't changed all that much. I still think those guys think they carry Roth to some extent. That may not be the way it was back, let's say, in 81, 82, when they were at the peak and Roth was really, this sort of superstar frontman. But I can imagine now with Roth's vocal struggles and people, saying things, the reviews of the concerts not being always so generous to Roth because of his off nights or whatever. I can imagine those guys sort of, being like, we're still this guy. It's like we were in '73. We got this guy who doesn't, he's a great showman, but he's not a great singer. And so I don't know. I would like to think that Eddie and Alex could sit down and be like, we wouldn't have made it without Dave the way we did, because I believe that. And I think most people who are fair-minded would say Van Halen never would have made it the way they did without Roth. That said, again, Eddie and Alex may have been successful musicians in other formats, but I'd like to think that they would think that if they look back. I don't know. It'd be an interesting question to ask those guys, wouldn't it, to hear when you think you would have made it big without Roth. I don't know.
I would hope that they would have that level of realization by this point in time. And again, you look at the music that Van Hagar put out. They put out some really good stuff that people enjoyed, but again, never really burst through the screen the way that the original version did, and that the original version can do on any given night now if they got it all going on.
You're on target about the Hagar stuff. I'm always trying to be clear with people. I have no potential dislike for Sammy Hagar. When I saw Van Hagar, I saw the '84 tour, and then I saw some of the tours with Hagar. But it never really measured. I don't think it measured up in terms of its impact from what the Roth stuff was. The Roth stuff was just so much more explosive and powerful. And to me, those albums, the 6 albums of Roth, sound so much more fresh than, let's say, Balance does. It's just, it's just the way it is. You put on, my estimation, you're going to put on Women and Children first, and then listen to Balance. Sort of like, I don't know. They just don't quite measure up.
No, I totally agree with that, and I think just about everybody does. And again, it was the original Van Halen group, again, that you did so well in chronicling here in this book, Van Halen Rising, how Southern California backyard party band saved heavy metal. Are there any key points that we didn't get across yet from the book that you'd like to get across to the audience here? I know we covered a lot of the material, but for something that's as rich with backstory as this book is, I know it's impossible to get there everything, but any key points we should still hit?
Yeah, I just think for me as an author, to be able to write the prequel to their fame, I just urge people to seek out the book and give it a good read and really try to think about, how hard those guys worked, and their road to fame was not at all simple. And again, I know I already said that once, but it's just it's as a writer, as soon as I start to get into this, I said, this is a great story. And I'm not saying that I wrote this book. I think anybody who, when you just sort of, look through the book, I was lucky enough to be able to write up the story, but just to have all the pitfalls they had along the way, the missed opportunities, the things that looks like the band's never going to go anywhere, we're never going to get out of Los Angeles, and the fact that those guys kept at it for years and years and years, and even when they got the Warner Brothers deal, like I said earlier, there wasn't a tremendous amount of confidence that type of music was going to break through like it did. And for those guys to have a top 40 hit, top 30 record, sell 2 million copies, become a worldwide sensation, when for years people were coming into bars and passing and listening to them and going, they're okay, but I'm going to sign this band instead. I think to me, it's one of the great American success stories. You got the 2 immigrants together with this guy, David Lee Roth, Eddie and Alex, came from America, came to America as young kids from Europe. It's a great, great story, and I just hope people would check it out.
Oh, it is. It's a wonderful book. Again, I really enjoyed getting a chance to read it here and preparing for the show, and it was a real treat. I would recommend it so strongly to everyone. Again, the title is Van Halen Rising, how a Southern California backyard party band saved heavy metal by Greg Renoff. Greg, thank you so much for being with us today. Wonderful conversation. Please don't be a stranger. We'll look forward to having you back in the future.
Hey, anytime. I'd love to come talk to you guys. It was great. Love the questions. Thanks for all the enthusiasm. And, yeah, people hit me up on Twitter at Greg Renoff. I'd love to connect with people, love to talk about music or whatever. And thank you so much for taking the time to read the book. So grateful. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate it. It was a great segment. Thank you so much. Like I said, I look forward to catching up with you down the road. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to FDH Lounge mini episode number 709.
As we bring the show to a close, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all Clear Channel affiliates, TNT, TBS, USA, UPN, Deadspin.com, YouTube.com, YTMND.com, MySpace.com, various blogs, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, IamBoard.com, Billboard.com, Google.com, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic, NBA TV, NFL Network, Sports Time Ohio, Athlon Magazine, Comedy Central, Cartoon Network, The Boomerang Channel, QVC, BET, The Spice Channel, Steno Notebooks, Manwich, Papermate Office Supplies, Waitresses, Strippers, Bartenders, Garbage Men, Janitors, Microwave Popcorn, the writers of The Office, Scrubs, Entourage, My Name is Earl, Oz, Metalocalypse and the Boondocks, Aquafina, and The Periodic Table of Elements.